the director of the YWCA Evanston North Shore, and we are excited to have a wonderful program here tonight. And so before I get started, I just wanted to remind folks that we have snacks off to the side here. We have some drinks in the corner. If you need a restroom, please feel free at any point to step out. They're right across the hallway here. And of course, anything you might need, just feel free to ask some of our staff that are floating around. Can I have some of the YWCA staff kind of hold their hands up in case folks have questions? See who they are. All right, wonderful. Give a round of applause. So before we kick off and actually get started, I'm going to invite to kick off our event, Charisse Ledette, our CEO and president here at YWCA Evanston North Shore. So give Charisse a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. As Roger stated, my name is Charisse Ledette. I'm the president and CEO here at YWCA Evanston North Shore. And whether you are in person or you're joining us virtually, I just wanted to get up and say your presence here today matters. It's very important when you think about, today's society, the division, the fear, the misinformation that we all intake on a daily basis. Our collective effort of being here tonight is just one step closer to us getting past this. And so I just wanted to really stand up and say how important it is to have you all here. The mission of the YWCA Evanston North Shore and the YWCA as a whole nationally is to eliminate racism and empower women. And if now is not the time for us to lean into that mission and stand firm. We know that we are unable to do that alone. And so it's very important that we have, our guest speakers tonight on the panelists who will bring all of their wisdom, their great education to play in dialogue as we talk through this. And I just ask that as you listen and engage tonight and reflect when you go home, please stay connected to us here at the YWCA to learn what we're doing, not just around equity, but the work that we're doing to ensure that our survivors, our communities that we serve, everyone has fair playing ground. Everyone has a sense of belonging when they walk through these doors. And the more that we can replicate this and do this outside of the YWCA, again, the more we will be the ones collectively to change the world and make this a better society for all. So again, I just thank you for being here. And I would be remiss if I did not thank my incredible team here at YWCA, the ones that raised their hands, and Roger. I'll ask you to please stand briefly. It would not be possible without all of their hard work and effort. And so I am truly, truly just honored to lead this team, but also to be amongst this incredible team as we come together and we think about how we can make things here at YW better. And so I appreciate you all. And we know it's a little warm in here, but I'm sure that this dialogue is going to make you warmer, so get ready to sleep.
Thank you, Charisse. So we're going to introduce our panelists in just a moment here, but I want to talk a little bit about why we're here tonight. I saw a quote by Robert Reich, who you may know, that was Secretary of under Clinton, and has been a political commentator throughout his entire career. And he wrote that America has never been subject to this level of authoritarianism and, quite frankly, sheer incompetence, as we've seen now, right? Yes. So I took that quote and I thought it really captured, I think, the sense of what a lot of people are feeling in the moment that we're in. But it made me pause, because I think a lot of what we're feeling today, or what a lot of Americans are feeling today, is an overreach that perhaps hasn't been present in some communities ever. But this type of authoritarianism has been very present in our history.
Yes.
And it's been very present in the history of Black Americans, of Indigenous folks, of women, LGBTQIA folks, and on, right? And so we have seen this play out at different times, and now it's just risen up again. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that we've been here before, right? And it's really hard to deal with right now, but we've had examples set by those who came before us on how to overcome where we're at right now. right? So let's keep that in mind. And we might be going through instances where we feel daily anguish or pain or despair, hopelessness. Those are all very normal things. And whatever we need to do as communities and as individuals to take care of ourselves and process whatever it is we're feeling, let's do that, right? Let's support one another. But let's do everything we can in that process to see what's on the other side of that. Because once we get that support that we need, that sense of hope, then on the other side is a huge opportunity to create something brand new that resists what is now and creates opportunity for all later, right? So please keep that in mind. But what can I say? We're living in a time when resegregation is back in vogue. Our schools are being resegregated, the media is resegregated, everything's resegregated. And everything that, we heard news this week. How many of you heard the news about the African American History Museum, the Smithsonian in Washington, having artifacts taken out, right? So there's a real concerted, unapologetic effort to kind of whitewash our history, right? And so that is happening. And we're living also in a post-truth world. Just this week, the 187,000th example I think I've heard of the current president stating that, when given information about prices going up and jobs going down, he says, well, jobs are going up and prices are going down, right? So if I say it, it must be true, right? So we have that very, very difficult challenge in front of us of living in a post-truth world where we have to really be intentional and really work hard at deciphering what's the reality for folks, right? And getting that message across. But as I've said before, each generation has faced their own moment of truth, and this is our moment of truth. And how we rise up will make the difference. And sometimes, I mentioned this quote shortly a little bit ago to my colleagues here. James Baldwin, I'm going to paraphrase, once said that, if asked if he doesn't feel any hope, and he says, I have to be optimistic because I'm alive, right? So as long as I'm alive, I have to have optimism that it can get better, right? And so I want to also lean on James Baldwin to kind of set the tone for some of the ground rules for tonight as well. And so when we do these types of programs and dialogues, this is an opportunity. This program is designed for us to listen, to learn, to process, to take into consideration different perspectives. This is not a debate tonight, right? So when we have questions and answers, this won't be a debate format. So I just wanted to make that clear. I also would encourage you all to be present in our time together today. So that make sure your cell phones are off, make sure we're engaging with one another, that we try to minimize side conversations. But of course, if you need to step outside, by all means, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And then also to remind you that this event is being recorded. We have a Zoom audience, and I'd like to say hello to all the folks on Zoom that are watching tonight. So thanks for being with us tonight. And to really take a moment to listen deeply to what our experts here are going to say, because there are going to be things that are said tonight that will be enlightening, that will be inspiring, that will be motivating. And there may be things that might bring us a little bit of discomfort, that might challenge us, that might make us revisit some of the assumptions we may have had about our own communities and our society and what we need to do. And so again, be open to what may come, and I think you'll find yourself leaving here with more questions and answers and a more energized enthusiasm to get engaged and involved.
Can you hear that? No.
Thank you again for being here, and I'd like to take a moment to now introduce the wonderful panelists. Let's start off with, to my right, Dr. Venoncia Baté-Ambrus, who's here. And Venoncia, if you could just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Let's try that again.
I think they can see you. Ayanna.
Yes, I'm Dr. Venoncia Baté-Ambrus. I am the Executive Director of the Healthcare Foundation of Northern Lake County, although I am here as a private citizen. So the remarks that I make this evening are not necessarily representative of the opinions of the Healthcare Foundation of Northern Lake County. I am a community health psychologist and a pastoral counselor by training. And I'm also studying health law at Loyola University of Chicago.
And we have Dr. Ayanna Brown.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Ayanna F. Brown. I am the Vice President of Strategic Growth and Partnerships at Erickson Institute. I am also the Chief Thought Leader of Thought Spectrum, LLC, which does professional consulting around educational issues, family school partnerships, curriculum development, and literacies. I too am here as an independent citizen and leader of thought partnering. And so I invite dialogue and conversation, but these thoughts indeed are representative of my scholarship, my research, my activism, my community engagement, and my lived experiences. So thank you for having me.
We have Dr. Connie Mixon.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Connie Mixon, and I'm a professor of political science, and I also direct the Urban Studies program at Elmhurst University. And I am an Americanist political scientist. So my background in research is in American political science with a sub-focus on urban politics, specifically Chicago politics. And I'm also the author, one of the co-authors of 21st Century Chicago, which examines the major social, economic, political, and governmental challenges facing Chicago. I also do a lot of talks and some media interviews every once in a while about national and local politics. And I'm just thrilled that I was invited to be here tonight. So thank you.
All right, well, let's just jump right in, folks. And I have to tell you, by the way, on election night, when folks are watching the guy with the sleeves rolled up on one channel, I'm watching Connie's analysis. So tune in if you can. All right, so I just came across results of a survey by Brightline Watch that was conducted in February of this year. And that survey found that a majority of political scientists believe that we are moving very quickly from a constitutional republic that practices representative democracy to authoritarianism. And so, the program talks about authoritarianism in the title, but we don't want to assume that everybody knows what that actually means. So I'm going to ask our panelists to just jump in, and maybe we can start with you, Connie. What is authoritarianism and why should we be worried?
Well, I'll give you a standard textbook definition that authoritarianism is a method of rule that suppresses political freedoms, civil liberties, civil rights, using the levers of government to shift power from the people to the hands of a ruler or a set of rulers. And it concentrates power in the hands of the leader. And it's not constitutionally responsive to the people like a democracy should be. Within authoritarianism, there's a worldview that believes in law and order and that the world overall is a dangerous place, and therefore we need a strong man or person to secure us in the face of threats. And we also see politicians using language, rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, populism. What's interesting about authoritarianism is that prior to the 1990s, countries went from being a democracy to authoritarian rule, usually through a coup, through some sort of violent coup or overtake. Right now, what we see worldwide is democracies dying a slow death, where it is piece by piece by piece of democratic norms, institutions are sliced away a little bit at a time. And those restraints that you would normally see in a democracy get sliced away. The political scientists have come up with 7 basic tactics, and I'll read this to you, in the pursuit of power. And we can probably think, when I give you the 7 areas, we can probably all think about examples just from present day that's happening under the Trump administration. The politicizing of independent institutions. Think about independent regulatory agencies, U.S. Department of Justice, FBI, the list could go on.
Right.
Spreading of disinformation, expanding executive power, quashing dissent, scapegoating vulnerable communities, corrupting elections, and stoking violence. I think we can think of examples of all 7 just within the first Trump administration, and certainly just within these past 98 days. I believe we're going to be at 100 days in 2 days. So There's a textbook sort of example in what we as political scientists know about authoritarian regimes. And as a political scientist, I agree with the majority of my colleagues in the discipline that we are backsliding our way into authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Connie, in that expert analysis, sort of breaking down the 7. I think what is important to recognize the complexity behind this is that this was a voted authoritarianism, right? So it was the functions of our democracy and the misuse of what I call lies. I'm very discursively, I'm always interested in how people come up with the term misinformation. that's very diplomatic to say lie. However, so when you talk about a democratic process where the use of misinformation or strategically preying upon an undereducated population as a mechanism to move forward an agenda, that is using the tool of democracy or weaponizing democracy in order to accomplish this authoritarianism. So as we see how it exists or how it's emerging strongly in this existence, its ability is not static. It's actually dynamic, which means authoritarianism that has swung this particular way has the ability in a pendulum to swing back. But that is the result of democracy in order for that voting process to then move back to center or swing the other direction. So that's a part of the later conversation on hope, right? And what then become the mechanisms and the tools by which information that is accurate and validated and credible, and how do we work with populations who are victims of misinformation or false truths, are enabled or empowered to learn and to think and to process. And part of that is recognizing that democratic practices have the capacity to move the other direction, but we do have to be very clear about these 7 things that have manifested itself and what we're witnessing and experiencing.
Thank you both. From a community psychology perspective, we always want to look at the but why, the root cause. How did we get here? So in preparation for this conversation this evening, I was really looking at what is the psychological framework. And so I found an interesting blog by Dr. Bernard Golden in Psychology Today that talked about the key points around authoritarianism, which includes an emphasis on instability versus security, forming and having loyal obedience to the strong man that or strong person that was referred to earlier. Also, anger related to financial, social, or emotional suffering, and the denial or displacement of that anger used to otherize and to stigmatize people within our community, as well as those who are coming into the country. So villainizing immigrant populations, for example. And so when we consider the root cause, it's also related to fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of loss of status, for example. And so there was a really interesting quote in this blog that I would like to share with you. And it talks about anger and how anger is directed under authoritarian regimes. And so anger directs our attention outward. And in so doing, it constricts our openness for self-reflection that is essential for increased awareness and understanding of our feelings and our desires. So again, we're misplacing anger, angst, and fear onto the other.
Yeah, so this authoritarian reality, for it to work, and Ayanna, you mentioned, how this current time that we're in, we voted it in, right? Yeah. And so you get to that point when you convince enough people that these ideas are valid, right? And how, in a country that has had a long history of othering and inferiority and superiority being defined in terms of populations, that history matters, right, for setting the stage to make this even possible, right? Because there's already within the DNA of our society this understanding of inferior and superior, and perhaps a reinforcing of it for folks who may have those preconceived fears or of the unknown, right? And so doesn't it really benefit authoritarians to feed off of that history that already exists, so things like that already happen, but then not teaching it fully because, right, you're in charge of the narrative.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, for mentioning that. And this is the part of our, if we take the confluence of these factors and place them all in one space, that becomes critically relevant. When we think about the 7 items that Dr. Mixon lifted up, it's important to recognize that when you work to regulate education and you get to control how students are able to process and understand history and interrogate that history, you are directly forbidding them from engaging in some form of critical analysis to then examine what's happening now. So by removing the opportunity to really understand the depths of social science, political science, economic, the entrance convergence of the economy, race, class, gender, and what's actually happening, then you prevent people who are about to be a part of the voting population. So for example, if we think of any student who's in high school right now, who's a freshman, they're going to engage in the next 4 years, become 18 and be able to vote. Well, how much information in the context of a history class, and that's just assuming they don't remember anything from 8th grade back. and if you ask a middle schooler, that's highly possible. Yes. But if you think about, even when you do have access to information, and this information has been able to be revisited, reproduced, replicated, and then you get in high school and your own developmental processes allow you to have your own sort of awakening. And you're like, oh, that's what that really meant, because now you are mature enough to really process and synthesize the multitude of types of texts that you're being able to interrogate. So your 9th grade ELA literature reading of Richard Wright has different meaning when you're also studying American government, and you're able to fuse these ideas together. So our students are terribly vulnerable right now, where those that are in high school in these next 4 years are going to experience the teaching of government and policy and history and literature with a direct absence of information, but they're going to be expected to vote in the next election, right? The next 4 years. So it's a convenient truth, if you will, to consider why one uses education as a mechanism to accomplish this authoritarianism. And it places a different kind of burden and responsibility that I'm very excited about with family. Parents are children's first teachers. And when we think about handing that responsibility over to schools, we've empowered them to be the only conduit of information. So this actually is a really great, I know, strangely stated, great opportunity for families, schools, and communities to learn from those principles of the civil rights movement, where communities took charge over what it meant to educate their kids outside of the structures of the institutions of schools. Not because teachers aren't great, but because they are now working under the control of the state or the control of the government, where they're not having the same permissions to engage in that intellectual rigor. So some of our best examples who've been villainized for this type of work, however, they had the absolute answers on how to educate families and children despite what the government was doing, was the Black Panther Party. Villainized for that work, but absolutely ahead of its time. And what it means to feed children, provide protections, and have a full ecological example of what it means to ensure that your kids are empowered and prepared to be voters, and what the power of voting does. And so we have to pay attention to what this means, not just for our taxes, but what does it mean for the pipeline of kids who are literally in schools right now, who will not experience content and therefore not be fully actualized in what it means for them to vote in 4 years.
I would just add, we've completely lost civic education in our K through 12 schools all across the country. I mean, Illinois has done better than some. We passed legislation a few years back to put civics back into our high schools, but we have generations of people in the United States that don't have an understanding of the foundations of American government. You've seen the surveys, right? 3/4 of Americans can't name who their US senator is. They can't name who the vice president is. I shouldn't have students appearing in my political science 201 American government class at the college level, typically taken by freshmen, who can't name the 3 branches of government. But I would say 2/3 of the students can't every year. over and over and over again. And we need to bring civics back into the schools. We took civics out after 1959 and the Soviets beating us into space with Sputnik because we needed to devote more attention to science and math. And we lost things like art and music, and civics were one of those things that went away. So I talked to folks, for example, from my mom's generation, they had civics classes. Now we have social studies. And I think it's really important, not that you're not learning good things in social studies, but we really need to focus on civic education, which will help folks understand the basics of government and not be so susceptible to mis and disinformation.
And as my colleagues have mentioned, the result is a less informed populace being ignorant of our rights and responsibilities as citizens in this country. And when you're not seeing yourself reflected in your pedagogy, it really impacts your socio-emotional development, your psychological development, your spiritual development for those of us who are inclined in that way. And there is no reason why, as a former professor in a graduate school of social work at a Hispanic serving institution, at the master's level, that I had students disclosing to me, in your class is the first time that I learned about my own Latine history in this country. That should not happen, yet there's intentional erasure of our collective histories in favor of a dominant narrative. And until that changes, we see the ill effects of that today with the rise of authoritarianism and lack of voting.
Well, part of that dominant narrative is that the United States is an exceptional nation, right? That we are favored as a nation and that we are the shining city on a hill. And I think a lot of that's fueled by the social dynamics that make up this country's history, right? Those who have been in power, and we're going to talk a lot more about power as we move through the evening. But when you think about those who've been in power, men, white Christian men, white heterosexual Christian men, right? Writing the rules, deciding who's superior, who's inferior, who should have access, who shouldn't, who is better prepared to run things and who isn't. We see that narrative popping up again, right? And that idea feeds into a larger mythology that I think a lot of us probably remember growing up hearing, is that we are an exceptional nation. Like we are unlike any other nation because we offer opportunities far superior to any other place on earth. And so no question that our society has been a place of opportunity for folks who have had access. But what does that myth do, that idea of exceptionalism do to help authoritarianism make it possible? And then, how does that impact communities that have not been deemed to be, as exceptional, so to speak, in our society? Where to begin, right?
Yeah. There were so many things just in the planting of the seed of the question. So here comes that moment where Roger gave you that disclaimer that there may be some things that are going to be said that's going to make you a little uncomfortable. I am uncomfortable, so be prepared. You'll call me that before we depart. I think one of the challenges in this myth about exceptionalism is that when we combine opportunity to earn money and the plausibility by which families can grow and one can move from different class statuses into different forms of wealth attainment, it fuels this sort of American ego of this being the place to go if you want a better life. And in many ways, people's lives have absolutely been improved as a result of getting to the United States. It is why we struggle with this conversation on immigration year after year after year, because being able to escape regimes, being able to literally survive, but then also being able to move and attain growth. And so it's a part of the American narrative. And so I believe it helps fuel this idea that we're exceptional, and not because we're necessarily intellectually exceptional, but because it is a place where people have been able to grow. It is a place where people have been able to thrive. And when we start to break this down in terms of how people arrive or where people arrive, the narrative starts to change. And so for years ago, John Ogbu, who was a renowned anthropological educational scholar, had to sort of break down, what type of immigration process that you experienced? Was it a colonialized immigration process, right? Or were you a part of an enslavement? You know, your immigration status navigates this notion of exceptionalism. But even within that same vein, you also have people who may have a stronger capacity to engage in learning and thinking in their countries, but we have imported large numbers of immigrants to the United States in order to advance educational agendas. And so the revisions to the various immigration acts reflect these times where we were trying to increase numbers of international students in order to grow certain industries. So we have used this idea of come to the United States so you have opportunity, but also we have used this as a form of increasing our intellectual labor force. Now, the problem is that we've also weaponized and villainized immigrants for coming to the United States concurrently. And so we start to create this sort of confusion around what does it really mean to really, really want immigrants, but then we start to qualify the journey and say which immigrants are the valuable ones. And so we start creating this idea that we're so exceptional, come here and be a part of this exceptionality, while at the same time not truly honoring the history, the languages, the people, the lives, the cultures, the values that come with the people who actually arrive. Now, while that may be a statistical and a migratory fact of how immigration has rose in the United States and the value of international students, we also know right now that full tuition paying students are more likely to be international students. Okay? So when you then create a university environment that says our enrollment is strongly dependent upon the international student who's more likely to pay full tuition to come to the United States, that narrative isn't necessarily placed before our great, American colleges and universities, where a great deal of its enrollment and the revenue generation is because of international students, but that's not the narrative you're given. Now, the second part of this that I want to place a small note on is that it is easy, and I want to be very clear, it's easy to villainize whiteness, and that is different than ideological whiteness. The way people think to advance a superiority belief that in order to be, one must be white, male, Christian, that's a convenient way to make people feel badly for being who they are, right? It's a villainizing effect. That's very different than examining the ideological factors that place whiteness as a more valuable thing. Not white people, but ideological whiteness. That's a whole nother conversation about dominance. Now, the reason why I mention this is because when you examine the study of race and racism in the United States that will use this sort of patriarchal Western image of white men, the ability for this intersection of race and class, male and white male, Christianity, these intersectionalities or Christian conservatism, in order for them to manifest itself, these things have never been able to remain at the pillar of their strength without white women.
Thank you.
That's the part we don't want to hear.
Women, race, and challenge.
So
Angela Davis.
when we talk about what happens in our electoral process, okay, this is the part where it's uncomfortable, right? In the United States, outside of the voting process, the work structures and what happens with people of color, specifically in the workplace, are often gatekept by white women. And so in order to not villainize white men, we have to explore whiteness and the intersection of race and gender, even when there is lack of opportunity within voting. Because when we talk about women's suffrage and the movement for voting, that movement served to support white women. However, the gatekeeping and the barriers to the improvement and progress of people of color, and you can look at the statistics on the voting. Who supported Trump? Who kept Trump in office? Who has pushed forward the conservative agenda? Or more practically speaking, who withholds women of color, specifically in the teaching force? The teaching force in American society has been over 85% white and female since Brown v. Board. And those Black teachers, brown teachers were pushed out of the education force and were told to take servant positions or to work as janitors or to go to the post office. And that the unionization of the teaching force, as well as the practices of career improvement, oftentimes intersects with the relationship between ideological whiteness at the power and movement of white women.
Reach.
Thank you, Ayanna.
Sure.
Thoughts, any kind of parallels in the healthcare industry as well?
Well, when I think about exceptionalism, I think about very coded language. We're not talking about everyone. We're talking about a very specific narrative. And when we talk about that very specific narrative of whiteness, it masks the exceptionalism that occurs in other populations. I think that it is exceptional that as a descendant of formerly enslaved people, that African Americans have been able to achieve what we've achieved in this country. That's exceptional. That Native Americans are still here after the genocide, the colonialism. That's an exceptional narrative. That LGBTQIA people still persevere and demand their rights in a very heterosexist and homophobic society. That's exceptional, but those are not the narratives that are being discussed or uplifted when we talk about exceptionalism. So I think it's really important to dig underneath the narrative. I'm a practitioner of a model called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, which the underpinning of that model is the idea of jettisoning a notion of human hierarchy, that we're going to peel back those layers of so-called exceptionalism around privileged identities versus everyone else. And so when I really think about these terms, I think about how they're used to pit one people against the next. Well, this group of exceptional Americans have managed to achieve this. Why can't you? And in the process, we ignore the historical context, which has led us to be where we are today.
Amen.
So we talk about, for example, social drivers of health in my field as a community health psychologist. Social drivers of health are the non-medical factors that impact us where we live, work, play, pray, grow, learn, etc. Those social drivers of health count for over 80% of what makes us healthy and our ability to show up and be who we are every day. Only 20% is really more, clinical, medical. And so when we talk about social drivers of health, we have to understand that our society is under attack. The programs that are supporting social drivers of health are being defunded as we speak. The people who are thought leaders who are driving these initiatives find themselves on the unemployment line right now. So this is real, and they're being replaced with people who do not have subject matter expertise to be leading any of these things. So again, when we think about exceptionalism, let's lift up the populations that are truly exceptional, and look at how we're defining exceptionalism so that we can come up with a new definition of what that really means.
Well, Connie, I was thinking Venoncia for that. And so I was thinking also that in the political realm, the very same tactics, are able to move forward ideas, for example, that now convince people that being inclusive is exclusionary, that being for diversity means someone else is being oppressed, right? To be equitable means that you didn't earn it, right? And we're seeing these folks being convinced of this, just as they've been convinced that healthcare should not be considered a human right, right? That education for the public is a bad idea, right? They want, more choices for those privileged enough to have that choice. And it's even convinced folks that things like social emotional learning is like suspect, this bad thing that, what are you trying to do to brainwash my kid, right? So in the political arena, these ideas of exceptionalism, we know better, it's really helped advance some things forward for some groups, right?
It absolutely has. I mean, it's a lot of populist rhetoric, very ethnocentric. And
what we even see is if somebody questions their government or government action, they're called unpatriotic, right? And they're told to, then go away, right? Take it or leave it. If you dare to question your government, and I would hold that questioning our government is at the cornerstone, the foundation of our democracy and one of the major pillars of democracy. But what we see as we start to, just I was talking about those 7 areas of authoritarianism, we see the chipping away, the slicing away of any sort of diversity program. I mean, the day Trump was inaugurated, he signed an executive order. The next day, he signed an executive order to stop any sort of mention of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Anything within the federal government that had that title, those folks were immediately fired. We're, thinking about institutions of higher education and other nonprofits that depend on the federal government for grants. Folks are going back and going through their grants and trying to figure out, well, what can we say instead? How can we include everybody in saying we're looking at just, populations of color? Well, maybe now we're looking at historically underrepresented, like all of the language. I mean, they've got Elon Musk running artificial intelligence, looking for keywords in these grants. And, it angers me to no extent, all of it, but they have been able to convince a large segment of the American population that they are somehow the ones being discriminated against, particularly when we look at the white population. And white women are the ones that, have turned the election in 2016 and in 2024. And it's been Black women that enabled Joe Biden to win in 2020. And, I'm not sure that I've got a good answer for it, but we have been seeing this whole idea of trying to get rid of any diversity, equity, and inclusion, and law firms, institutions of higher education are just kowtowing to the Trump administration.
Well, as someone who has practiced diversity, equity, and inclusion work for over 20 years, I spent a majority of my career in higher education. It's funny for me personally because in social settings for decades, people would ask me what I do. When I said I did diversity, equity, and inclusion, they kind of looked perplexed and didn't know what it was, right? Now I go to social settings and I'm kind of looking for a place to kind of just tuck away on. How are we doing? Because now everybody knows about DEI, right? But it's been interesting to see how it's played out because some of the after effects of what we've been seeing the last few months has kind of caused some populations, perhaps geographic populations, folks to kind of wake up a little bit. And I'm thinking specifically of the attacks on the Department of Education, for example, the attacks on access to healthcare in certain rural areas, education in rural areas. When you think of rural America, it's deep red country, right? That's a lot of what we learn about how the voting patterns of folks in rural areas around the country. But one of the interesting dynamics that's popped up in recent months and even in the last couple of years has been kind of a pushback from the very same folks in rural areas who suddenly are realizing that a defunding or an elimination of the Department of Education means their kids have nowhere to go, right? So now what, right? So can we talk a little bit about how that has kind of shaped up as well and communities are being affected in ways maybe they didn't anticipate?
Sure. I mean, it's just going to add Medicaid too. Yeah. When you're cutting Medicaid, rural hospitals depend on Medicaid. Those clinics, those hospitals are going to close.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I think is really important is that when we decide we're going to have a forum to actively talk about racism, you have to really be comfortable with talking about racism. I'm sorry, but it's called United Against Racism. That's the name of the forum,
yes.
Right? And as someone who has studied discussion of race in classroom settings and engaging in racism, you sort of have to recognize that it's the topic that nobody wants to discuss, but it's the very thing that has organized our society. So when you decide to take this up, which is why my comfort level is very high, is that it's unpopular, but it's sort of like, I don't have the answer. I'm going, yeah, you do, Connie. You know exactly what the answer is. So this is the cornerstone of what Derek Bell, to your question, identifies as the entrance convergence. When the factors were placed of what would be the benefits to this conservative agenda were placed among many voters, they didn't imagine that this was about them. They decided that this was about Black people who were allegedly benefiting. This was about brown people who are automatically here illegal or violent and drug dealers. This was, and it was never about Asian people because they are the model minority, to your language about that idea, right? These are all stereotypes, folks. Okay.
Because they left out Oliver North, the biggest drug dealer in Big Pharma.
So, to your point, when people are led to believe that the logistics and the operationalization of these decisions under this banner of DEI would absolutely converge with class and intersect with poverty. Those same voters are now met with a moment. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they automatically agreed and voted to this agenda, but I'm certain that if we talk about the stock market, there are some folks who are already quite comfortable in their living, didn't realize that some of these economic agendas would also deplete their stock too. Right? It didn't filter out for like the stock of the minority population only. So this entrance conversion factor requires us not to engage in the villainization of our communities. Otherwise, Connie and I would never be the friends that we are, because that stereotyping would suggest that we're not colleagues and friends and confidants, right? As opposed to saying, what are the ways of thinking about humans and human nature and relationships and community and wellness that allows us to say we are all impacted by a single decision where the intent might have been one thing, but the consequence is the other. And unlike the immigration language that was used in the 1960s and 70s of an unintended consequence, this was actually quite intentional. And here's the hard part of the why we know this to be true. Project 2025 did not originate in 2025. The project is the greatest example of long game. Reagan was handed a draft. And it continued. The organizations who participated in the building, their grandchildren now sit on that board. So we don't want to be caught off guard by the idea, not only that this isn't new, but this was planful. And the important cornerstone to this is that this project was not handed to Trump in 2016, because Trump wasn't necessarily the kind of conservative that they needed at the time. He was a wild card. However, in order to be reelected, there were machinations put in place to say, okay, we're gonna help you out. We're gonna hand you the playbook, follow the script. So we can't become so incensed by the present that we don't recognize this attack is really a reflection of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. This is a reflection of 1968. And the gathering of a think tank to build out pushback has been long game.
Yes.
Now, I suffered through reading all 922 pages of Project. And it would be easy, I had to, light incense around my computer just to protect it, right? But despite that, that's not the first document ever written that works against the interests of people who are not white. And again, I'm using this language because it says united against racism, not united against white people. I want to be really, really clear. So we have to be really active and thoughtful and planful about naming things clearly. I don't want to go to the hospital with a pain in my foot and have them replace my liver. We have to name racism for what it is and talk through that without running away from it, conveniently talking about other topics. So.
And when we talk about racism, oftentimes we focus on the interpersonal, he versus me. But we have to understand that racism operates not only at the interpersonal level, but that at the institutional level, at the organizational level, so it's micro, macro, meso, et cetera, et cetera. So from my lens, I look at health inequities. Health inequities occur because of institutionalized and organizational racism. And in a just society, they would not occur. You would not see differences in life expectancy based on zip code, skin color, race, ethnicity, immigration status, et cetera, et cetera. So from where I sit, Lake County, Illinois is halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee, two of the most segregated cities in the country. Redlining run amok. We talk about resegregation. These cities were never desegregated largely. So we have to be very, intentional about recognizing that. And so how health inequities work. When we look at Chicago, for example, there was a study that looked at the green line, starting in the loop, going all the way through the west side of Chicago, and then into the western suburbs, the more affluent areas like River Forest and Oak Park. Life expectancy in the loop is 85 years of age. It goes down drastically as you go through the west side of Chicago. Some of the communities include East Garfield Park, 72 years of age. West Garfield Park, 69 years of age. South Lawndale, 82, which is kind of interesting. You might say, well, that's not that different than some of the more affluent areas, but there's a dynamic at play called the Hispanic paradox, health paradox, which really looks at when immigrants arrive to this country, they arrive more healthy. But the longer they stay here, the unhealthier they get, and their health life expectancy mirrors that of the general U.S. population. You travel further west on the Green Line, for example, and North Lawndale, 72 years of age, Oak Park, 81, and River Forest, where I used to reside, 84 years of age. So you're looking at a 16-year life expectancy difference between the Loop and West Garfield Park, for example. Now, once again, looking at Lake County, we have a similar situation at play there. And if you haven't seen this, I highly encourage you to check out the Brushwood Center at Ryerson Wood. They have what's called the Health Equity and Nature, a Changing Climate in Lake County, Illinois, which is a very interesting study. But one of the things that they looked at was life expectancy in Lake County. And it mirrors what we see in Chicago. There's about a 15-year difference in life expectancy between the more affluent North Shore community of Lake Forest and a far less affluent, largely community of color of North Chicago in Lake County. So again, when we're talking about health inequities, or we flip the paradigm and move towards healthcare justice, in a just society, we would not see these type of statistics. But unfortunately, that's not the society in which we reside, largely because healthcare is not necessarily seen as a human right. Healthcare is seen as a privilege of those who are employed and whose employment will benefit them via health insurance. But it doesn't really, our Constitution, unfortunately, does not prioritize healthcare as a human right. But what is more human than your right to be healthy and to obtain optimal health?
And I think it's important to point out that the city of Chicago itself has the largest life expectancy gap of any city in the entire nation. Streeterville, folks are living to be 90 years old. You go to Inglewood, they're living to be 68, 69. They are 13 miles apart from each other. You can ride your bike that distance. And when we look at all kinds of inequities, we can trace it back to the legacy of redlining and restrictive covenants, particularly if we start looking at suburban areas. I had a student in 2020 who looked at areas of Chicago that had been redlined and then was looking at the first outbreaks of COVID-19 and then looking at deaths from COVID-19. They were all happening in areas that had been redlined. You saw the deaths go up. The first cases were happening in areas that were redlined. Those are the same areas that lack access to quality education, lack access to effective public transportation. They're also food deserts. So all of these socioeconomic factors, I mean, it's generational. It's not as if, well, we redlined, 70 years ago or 100 years ago, that's over with now, but it's generational and it has an impact for generations on. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you guys know that that's really important to understand those disparities and how it plays into not just individual racism, but the structural, systemic, institutional racism that still persists within the United States today.
And I think it would be remiss if we didn't mention how these things intersect with the relationship between housing and school. Because we know what drives people's interest to pursue certain communities for where they live, particularly if they have families and school-aged children. You're going to pursue spaces where there's much more green space. You're looking for a different quality of type of school. Quality often is a reflection of the investment based on the tax base. And the tax base is going to drive the incomes of the people who live there. And so you sort of get this reproduction of who lives in the place. You have many families who don't choose areas where they want to live until they look at the schooling first. And so where the school is located, what resources, what the demographics are, often drives that. And when you see the relationship between housing and the economic structure based off of that, which is our history of redlining, what is subtle up under that is the frequency by which you're able to get healthy food. And so what happens when and I lived in Forest Park, so I lived in Forest Park too, we were neighbors, very much so. And so when you think about the difference of when you go to some neighborhoods and you have 15 different grocery stores and grocery options
That you can walk to.
all, ride your bike to, walk to, and that's another form of exercise, not because you don't have a car, not because you don't have access to public transportation, but by default, it's an option of choice. And so when many people think, just move into another neighborhood. Sure, right.
Easier said than done.
The idea is that your tax base is used as a mechanism to push people out and to invite people in. And so you think about the role of regentrification and what happens in communities when they become attractive enough to people who have more economic leverage. When that economic stability or increased economic privilege moves back into those neighborhoods, then you see more options become available. So if you think about Bronzeville, if you think about Hyde Park, and then the neighborhoods that are right adjacent to those areas, you have economic power that shows up. And what shows up becomes more health opportunities, sometimes just in green space alone. And you see these cute initial things like public park improvement. This is where people get to play, where children get fresh air. And so those oftentimes becomes indicators and drivers of how we see these intersections of wealth and economics play itself out, but they're rooted in a racial agenda that did not necessarily afford the same opportunities to others. So in our days of housing projects along State Street, okay, you didn't see those same green spaces that were there. Now, if you drive State Street and you see what has been revisited, or if you're on the west side of Chicago, close to UIC, and what's been built up in sort of the medical district, you see totally different types of structures and the remnants of those former ways in which people were ghettoized into housing structures that did not permit the same kind of clean air, clean access, green space, bike riding paths, all these things that come oftentimes with wealth and whiteness. That's when you see this interesting shifting in the community. You can have middle-class Black communities move in to neighborhoods with the same economic strength and not see the benefit of companies reinvesting with stores. They don't reinvest with businesses. You won't see a shift and turn those economics into a different type of economic investment comes, which is oftentimes associated with risk.
And if you take that same concept and you look at it from a health perspective, when we look at maternal child health, for example, African-American women with a college education have worse birth outcomes than white women with no high school education. And why is that? So we also have to look at the effects of racism on the body that we carry in our bodies that are intergenerational, how it affects our epigenetics. I mean, these are real implications. And I also want to touch on the concept of housing. Housing is health. If you do not have adequate housing, it's very difficult to maintain your health and well-being. I mean, another repercussion of redlining is that those who bought houses on contracts had to work multiple jobs in order to pay for those contracts rather than getting a standard mortgage. And so they did not have money to put back into investing in their homes necessarily, to keeping them up the way that we see in other communities where they had traditional mortgages. And so then when, people pass by those communities, well, why do they look, it's just those people, they don't know how to keep up their neighborhoods. That's actually not the case, but it does have a real health implication. There was a documentary on PBS called Cooked. Has anybody seen Cooked?
Yes.
Okay. And so we're looking at the repercussions of those redlining housing structures where people did not have adequate ventilation, air. I mean, it might be a little bit warm this evening, but think about it. If you do not have, insulation in your home, or you don't have access to air conditioning, or you don't have street canopies of trees on your streets to help, keep the temperature down, then you're living in highly dense areas where you don't have access to, clean air, ventilation, et cetera, and that impacts your health. And we saw that in Cooked when we looked at where in Chicago were people dying during that. I believe it was in the 90s, the lethal, 1995. Where were those communities? Those communities were the same ones that were redlined. So there are all types of repercussions that we see in redlining that pertain not just to economic health, but physical health, psychological health, all of it, those social drivers of health.
I would say that zoning is the new redlining, particularly in suburban areas. The way you zone can be exclusionary. If you require large lot sizes, if you require homes of a certain square footage, if you require that they be built out of brick or some other materials, you limit who can actually live in that area. And every community has an incentive to zone, we would call it snob zoning, to zone in this way, because then it actually increases the property values, which increases the property taxes. And then you don't have very many people living in that particular town or that suburb who need social services. So I think about a town like Elmhurst, where I live in the city of Chicago, but I teach at Elmhurst. And I think about how Elmhurst is zoned. They have snob zone. They zone in an exclusionary way so they can then use those property taxes that they collect to invest in their downtown area. But they also don't allow multifamily housing, right? The only multifamily housing they allow are high-end condos and townhouses. So I would say, as you think about what you can do, is you can attend a local zoning committee meeting, right? Zoning is the most political and most powerful thing that local governments do, and most people's eyes just gloss over. But those are the meetings you want to go to.
It just makes me think about how, the attacks on DEI, the attacks on the teaching of our racial history and all those kind of things, are often couched under the term colorblindness, right? That we can't be discriminatory anymore by bringing up color because talking about race is racist, right? And so, when I hear all of this, it just makes me really understand more why this insistence on colorblindness helps those that are very color conscious when they are zoning for new developments or housing, when they are taking into consideration, schools and so forth. So it's interesting that quite often, and at least from my perspective, the very same folks who shout out colorblind are the very folks that notice the very first thing about people's identities in all sorts of ways, right? And it just makes me really think about the folks that have been impacted and affected by what we've seen throughout our history, but especially in the last few months. And I've heard from many folks privately. I know I have family members that have been directly impacted or are fearful of their circumstances. I have children who are being directly impacted through their identities as well, based on what's happening. And so, you know, what would you all recommend in times like these? What do we think can really bring a ray of light or some hope to folks who feel defeated, who feel hopeless, who feel like I need to leave or I have to hide? You know, in the case of my own children, I have a child who, you know, is considering going back into the closet as an out lesbian woman who now works for the National Park Service and now is, you know, finds herself in a situation where her existence is being threatened, you know? So any advice or hope for folks to, how can they, you know, persevere during these times?
So thank you for the question, because I think ultimately even your choice to be here this evening, you know, you could have been anywhere on a Monday evening and you chose to be here, which suggests that this desire to be in community and to talk and to look for answers and responses is they're highly important. I have the privilege of doing a research study that I refer to as Resilient Elders, the Children of Brown. And this research study that I've been conducting for the last 3 years explores what were the lessons being taught to the children who experienced education in the South before Brown v. Board, during Brown v. Board, and after. So what this translates to, we have elders who were in school before they were desegregated, who are still with us. They experienced the pre, the during, and the post. And they are upwards of the ages of 70, all the way through. My oldest participant in my research project is 97 years old. And remains leading in communities and working and planning and organizing, and not just for social action or political response, but building up next generations of young people and being very active. And in this study that I've been honored to conduct, it requires a different type of listening for me. I don't refer to them in my methodologies as participants. They are elders. These are the people who understand what the time that we're experiencing right now. They know what it's like with fire hoses and dogs. They know what it's like in a very physical way. So for many of us, we're experiencing intellectual stressors. We're experiencing healthcare and environmental stressors. Well, for our elders, in many ways, add the physicality of someone physically assaulting you daily, right? And so when I talk to the elders in terms of what did your parents tell you about what to do when you go to school tomorrow? What were some of the wisdoms and things what guided you through these experiences? And some of the things that they talk about that helped me connect with this issue of resiliency was not hiding. They were very clear about being in relationship and in community with one another. No, you know, for example, one of my elders was 7 years old, her sister was 10, and they were still responsible for the walk to school together. And along the way, they would pick up the next person and the next person and the next person, and 10 of them are walking the 2 miles while the bus is going by and the other children are throwing things out the window. Right? While they're still, and they talked about singing songs and playing games, and they couldn't wait for the next day to go to school for hide and seek. And they were such a community that while it was tumultuous in the most extreme way, there was a feeling of bondedness. There was a feeling of connectedness. So some of the things is you must be in relationship to your allies. You must be in relationship to those people who are going to pour into you. And some of those people may be unexpected allies. Well, how do you find them? You actually have to talk. It's an amazing concept. You have to do what you're doing right now, because this is going to lead to how the negative version of this is how Project 2025 was formed. People talked, they got together, they met, they planned, they discussed. Right? We have to be a part of this building relationships with one another, because it is the very thing that allows us to engage in practices, processes, meetings, discussion, voting that lead us to a certain type of direction. So you don't You don't get to be 97 years old in 2025 and have seen every version of this and still have hope unless you've engaged in sets of actions that allow you to feel different about what you do. So some of my early statements, learning from our elders, is who is your community? And it does require you to say, if my community are only the people who look just like me, I'm doing community wrong. You know, that's the racialized version of it. I've got to think about ideological community, not phenotypical community. Okay. The other piece to this that I think is going to be hard, to your point, Connie, is, you know, Black women are tired of saving America.
Yes! Yes! Labor is never
Saving
over.
America from America.
Yes.
You know, we've done the labor already. That's not excluding Black men. That's not excluding other people. But that labor is a hard labor, only to be returned and have that spited against you again and again and again. So to a certain extent, it's sort of like we need to get together and build our allies. I'm really, really interested in how these honest conversations, where you may not have friends anymore, you may lose some people because you're saying, you know what, this is not okay. And that gives you a way to build allies and relationships. Those allied relationships and strengths are bigger than phenotype. They're bigger than that. And that's a brave, bold move that I've just become very comfortable that if I can survive a breakup with an old boyfriend in high school, I can absolutely survive a breakup of my neighbor who I only met 10 years ago over property taxes. You know, we are in something different, and we have to not hide behind the fear of not wanting to be seen as, because our elders had to do this. And I can't ask those elders to keep doing that work for me. They should be able to live in their golden years comfortable and without fear. But they are re-experiencing trauma. My legs are now the able legs. My body is now the able body. Why are we asking our elders to carry this weight? Right. Which means as elders, we actually have to talk to our kids about some stuff. And that's inconvenient and uncomfortable. But otherwise, what we do now is the history 20 years from now, and people are going to be like, well, what did they do? You know, well, I was unafraid of not having my friends. We normally go play pickleball on Saturdays, and I started talking about race, and they didn't want to play with me no more. Well, I'm sure your grandkids are going to be real pleased with us about the choices we made, and that's going to be uncomfortable.
And when we talk about grandkids, we really shouldn't be leaving future generations the mess that they did not create.
Yes.
It makes them feel as though I don't even want to show up at the voting booth because I didn't create this and my vote is not going to matter anyway. So we have to think about what we're leaving to future generations. I'm also going to paraphrase Audre Lorde that talked about self-care as a form of radical resistance, of political resistance. And so when I talk about self-care, I'm not just talking about, you know, a spa day with the girls, which is great. I love that just as much as the next person, but I'm really talking about thinking about individually, what do you value? What makes you feel good? And making time to be able to do that for yourself. Because when we talk about resilience, that act of self-care helps to promote resilience. Resilience is a wonderful thing, but I would really like to get to the root cause of why do we need to be resilient in the first place and begin addressing those issues so that we require less resilience. So that's really key as well. And then when we look at the community level, going back to relationship building and getting to know the so-called other, racial healing circles, which are part of the truth, racial healing, and transformation model that I discussed earlier, is an intentional modality where you bring people together who may not necessarily converse with each other, at least not on a deep level on a daily basis, to really emphasize through prescriptive questions that start more on the casual side and then go deeper and deeper to really emphasize our common humanity. And it's through intentional relationship building, through exercises like racial healing circles, or through coming to groups, events like what we're experiencing this evening. Those are the ways that we become engaged. And so there is such a thing as self-care, but then if we take that to the macro level and look at community care, This is part of community care. This is how we show that we care not only for ourselves, but for our neighbor who we might not think has a lot in common with us, but in fact, you know, once you get to know the other, you might find that you have some very real shared concerns and shared goals, but you'll never get to have that opportunity unless you engage in genuine dialogue.
So it occurred to me as I was listening, I think what we just heard from both Venoncia and Ayanna was, you know, absolutely something that individuals could definitely take to heart if they really apply. I think the other thought that occurred to me, and I'm looking at Therese across the way, organizationally, right? I think the very same doubts, concerns, fears, you know, ideas, certainly as organizations, we've been thinking about how we adjust in this time that we're in, right? And I think we've here at the YWCA gone through the full gamut of what do we do? Do we hide? Do we not hide? You know, I think we've explored every option, and I think in the end, very much came out to if we even attempted to hide, we wouldn't even recognize ourselves, right? We wouldn't recognize like what the hell are we here for? Excuse the audience language. But you know, we are in that time when you feel alone and fearful and maybe are insecure in terms of what this might all mean for your organization, the very same tactics and the same actions of connecting with community, finding allies, talking to one another, talking to organizations you might not think have a lot in common, and you suddenly find you intersect on a lot of levels, can strengthen both of your efforts, right, and multiple efforts. And so I think that's what we're in the middle of right now, is really trying to assert ourselves in terms of re-emphasizing our mission, recommitting to our values, and saying we're not only turning away, we're doubling down on who we are, and we're going to be ourselves fully and authentically. I think that's what you can expect from us, but I think we want to also feed off of and empower other organizations as well who may be feeling like they're in the same place as well, because the tide will turn if we stand firm, right? And if we stay true to who we are. And I think that advice is incredibly valuable for individuals, but it could also benefit organizations and communities as well. So thank you for that.
No, the strength of community organizations and partnerships is something that's incredibly important, because when you're sitting alone thinking that you're going to have to confront or address some of the issues that have happened, for example, with the executive orders, it's really easy to feel as if, you know, we have to do these things, otherwise we will not survive. And particularly if you're more dependent upon federal funding than not. And one of the challenges is that there's a reality of compliance, because that's our obligation when we talk about this relationship with federal compliance. And we can absolutely not like it. It doesn't mean that we can't be in community and in partnership to build out programming and support families and children in a way in which that allows them to thrive. And so you sort of have to think about the through line of what is your mission? What is your purpose? What is the legacy of the work that you're trying to do? And how are you trying to do it in a just way? How are you trying to do it in an impactful way? What are you trying to build and lead? Because despite what this particular presidential administration believes or does, there's going to be another one to follow. It may be a milder version that more people are able to chew and swallow, but it doesn't mean it may not hold on to some of these same beliefs or roots, you know, depending on how voting swings. But regardless of that pendulum of a vote, you still have to have a belief in the purpose of your organization and why you do the work that you do. And so building out strategic partnerships and an opportunity to be in dialogue allows you to be more clear about what is your belief and what is your mission and how can you align, because the more people that connect and build and provide resources for one another in order to serve our communities and to serve families, you're building better communities. And that's something that's going to outlive any administration. So we can't think about the work we do as reactionary only to a particular administration, as opposed to who are you and what do you stand for and what does that mean in terms of the work that you're trying to do for humanity. That always has to be better, because that will be fleeting. But we still have to be planful. Because again, long game is important. You still have to be planful. But we have to be in partnership and a relationship with one another.
That's a great segue to one of the other questions I want to ask, but I do want to pause for just a moment. When all of you arrived tonight, you may have signed in at our front desk. There may have been an opportunity for you to grab a sheet and maybe write a question down. I just wanted to take a moment to say that if you did grab a sheet and wanted to have a question for our panelists, please go ahead and just write your question out. We'll probably have one of our YWCA folks float around. And if you want to hold your question up, they'll come around and collect whatever ones you may have come up with. But in the meantime, while we're doing that, if you hadn't had a chance to do that, I do have a question kind of off of what you just said, Ayanna, and that is that it has to be a long game, right? It has to be one of those things that takes a real investment, right? And it kind of begs the question that you and I both talked about, Ayanna, as we were prepping for this about a week ago. We were kind of talking about, what does it look like in our own lives? What does it look like for people who want to be invested? And the question came up, well, what is real activism? What is real allyship? What does that actually look like? Because we talked about how the current Project 2025 effort started decades ago, right? Through the Reagan years, through Bible camps, through, like, name it. There were all sorts of societal outlets for folks to start from a very early age, learning about the exceptionalism that they believed in, so that when they arrived at 30, 40, 50 years old, they could take leadership positions, really being ingrained with this. Activism or involvement does it take on our part? Is it just coming to a meeting here or there, or to an event, or does it require more than that? Open to any of you.
I'd say it requires a lot more than that. I mean, it's a decision that you make yourself. What do you stand for? You're talking about organizations, deciding what organizations stand for. We as individuals have to decide what we stand for and what we're willing to fight for. And that can be attending meetings, certainly, but, also making conscious decisions about how we consume and where we consume from. And our voice is probably the strongest asset that we have. If any of you have heard our Governor Pritzker over the weekend in New Hampshire, we have to protest. I mean, a democracy only survives with educated and engaged citizens. And we can't the fire department's not coming. The country is on fire, and we are the ones that are left to fight it. And maybe it's locally, maybe we can make a difference locally, but it can also be calling your representative, finding out who your representative is, going to local meetings, bringing a friend to local meetings, and making differences where you can. But it's not something you can just, tweet about or make a Facebook post like, oh, I went to this march, right? It's really doing the hard work of activism and educating yourself and playing a role in deciding what the future of the United States is actually going to look like.
And I'll add to that, when we think about activism, don't do to, don't do for, do with. There is a slogan out of the South African or African disabilities movement, nothing about us without us. It's great to be in community and want to work towards social justice, but you must necessarily work with those who are most impacted and most affected, and don't think that you can do it for or do it to, but truly do it in collaboration with.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioned that. There's some research, there's some scholarship that I've been writing and involved with, and the principle of Ubuntu, which is a sense of collectivism, and that the strength of the community is rooted in the collective movement and the activity that you're pouring back into the community that you've been strengthened by. There's this obligation of codependency of community in order to build. And it's a challenge because oftentimes when we think of the word activism itself, we immediately get thrown sort of into like the 1960s, and we think about a single solitary person in the head and a body of that person. We start thinking about the SCLC, we start thinking about, a very Martin Luther King kind of representational sense of activism. And we are no longer a part of a society where we're sitting waiting for that one person to emerge, and then we all sort of coalesce our energies around that one person. What is important to recognize that some of our most profound thinkers and listeners are young people, and they're doing it using multiple medium fashions. They're globally connecting with one another. the reach in terms of the strength of listening and paying attention is where young people and elders must be in dialogue with one another. And in those dialoguing, there's different types of assets. We all bring a different gift to the table in terms of how we will work. Now, one of our challenges when we think about the different ways in which we can be active is that we have to sort of do that ever widening circles, if I go back to Elmhurst's language, of tossing sort of the pebble into the pond. And then there's things that happen right in your neighborhood, and there are things that happen locally, and then there's things that happen regionally, and then there's things that happen in your state. And you sort of have to think about at which level is going to impact you the most, where you're going to have an immediate follow through and that you can sustain. And while you're doing that, you're also taking another rung in that circle. So it's not either or, it's not one thing, but you don't have the capacity to be everywhere. I can barely make it to work, boxing, Pilates, my kids' school, my daughter's lacrosse game, and make sure I have on the same matching shoes sometimes. You can't, I have to check. You can't be everywhere. So when you're deciding to be engaged, the idea is not to be so engaged in everything that you have now just burned yourself out and you've defeated the point about wellness that you just described. The point of allyship and Ubuntu is that you connect and you build and you engage, so different people who are a part of that collective dialogue are feeding into the different pieces to that network. But we can absolutely say your local politics and what's happening in your town is the immediate touch point to the next thing that we can tap into. But don't uninvite young people. Don't use, well, you haven't lived long enough to know better. And that immediately turns people who are 21 and younger, like, I don't want to play anymore, because you've already decided that I'm not, that's a quote from my mom, you ain't lived. It's like, okay, mom, you know. But you have to remember that even as you galvanize and activate, you have to listen to young people and listen to the experiences that they have. Don't dismiss them because they're not yet 25. And so you automatically assume that those things aren't relevant anymore. And then you have to find ways where the mediums and the modalities where they feel empowered will carry them, because they're not going to be 12 forever. And if we are able to nurture the energies and the thoughts and the concerns that they have at 12, when they're 25, they're going to have something that have already been enriched and rooted in them, that they have a way of thinking. The other piece that I think is also important, and I'm going to return to this as a forever teacher, is that when we know our kids are not having access to information, we are not dependent upon school structures as the only place in which we educate our children. So there's nothing wrong with Saturdays. There's nothing wrong with mid-afternoon on Sundays. There's nothing wrong with book clubs and gathering with your neighbors to do some of these things, because those things are also your rights too. You still live in a democracy. You still have the right to engage your own families and nurture the things that are valuable to you and invite other people to be in a part of that as well. So building community is another form of activism, but you must think about, what are we doing this for? And then decide what your next step is. There's always another step.
And what we've described in terms of intergenerational relationships and ensuring that the youth has a voice is really looking at power structures and how power is diffused in communities. Looking at informal power versus power that is considered given by authority, and how do we ensure that all forms of power have that voice? So if your narrative, if you're taking up the most space in the room, you know, making sure that there is room at that table for others whose narrative aren't being represented, and making sure that the power is being diffused in ways that is inclusive, where everyone has the ability to have a voice, particularly those who have been historically on the margins. So how can you leverage your intersectional identities to support someone else? I'm thinking about an instance where I was doing a DEI training at Dominican University for our graduating social work students. And a student came up to me after I was talking about intersectional identities and power, and she said to me, Dr. V, I don't feel like I have any power. I just can't relate to what you were talking about. And the person who said that was an African-American woman, and she was an older woman who was a non-traditional student going back to school to earn her degree. And I thought, that's really unfortunate that she has been, so conditioned to think that she does not have power. The fact that she was in a private institution earning a graduate degree is a form of power where people may listen to her that won't listen to other people. So she can open the door using her institutional power and usher in space for people who don't have that particular credential. So again, just opening our minds and thinking about how we can leverage our own personal power in service with others, not to others and not for others, but with others.
I'm motivated. What's interesting as I was listening, this is I think the pragmatic side of me coming out. I heard the word community. I heard the words in reference to DEI. I can't remember the exact word you used, but I remember thinking that these words are now like being banned, right? Community, diverse, right? So there's even an effort to in social emotional learning, right? Being in community with one another is now a bad thing, right? So we not only have to empower each other through these concepts and ideas, we have to overcome the narrative that's been put out there that those are actually bad things, right? And I think what's interesting about a power structure, and I'm going to get to some, we have a lot of questions here we're going to get to in just a moment. And thank you all for your questions. The challenge we have in being in community with one another is that we exist and live within systems that economically, politically emphasize individual competition, right?
Yeah.
And winning over others, right?
The sociopathic mantra.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
There's a mindset and a dynamic of having to win over, which incentivizes dehumanizing or defeating others, right? And so that's a challenge of how do you build community within a system that operates in the opposite way, right? And so it's a real challenge we have to consider, because certainly the rugged individualism ideology and mindset, you can argue has benefits. Like who wouldn't argue that you can encourage individuals to try harder, to improve, to grow? Sure, we all, I think, would probably agree to a certain extent that those are at a base level sound, ideas for how we should pursue our lives and our practices and our work. But that in and of itself does not encounter or face the realities of systems that we confront along the way, right? Systems that are designed to prohibit us in many ways from, being that rugged individual, and that we have to rely upon one another. And that comes into conflict. Those ideologies come into conflict. So just wanted to put those 2 cents in. All right, we have so many great questions. I know we're gonna try to get through this. We're gonna do what's called a speed round here, all right? So I'm kind of making this up right now. Here we go. It's like speed dating, but speed round. All right, so we're gonna go through a question, and I'm gonna ask if we can answer probably within 30 seconds or less, each of us, all right? Just concise response. And the winner will receive YWCA swimming. All right. So before I get into some of these questions, I know we had one question in front that I wanted to offer you the opportunity to ask if you'd like. I know you had written it down a while ago, so I know you've been waiting. So let's go ahead and we have a person here in the front that wants to ask a question, and then we'll get into your written question. So please.
Thank you. I want to say that who protects us from the lawless political sociopaths? America is addicted to denial. America created Trump, and we're a fraud of a democracy. We've never had one man, one vote. We have always been a fascist police state. The government has charged the media with espionage, and we should have a federal law that civics should be taught. We need voter education, not just voter registration. According to the UN 2018 UN report on extreme poverty and human rights, we are an impoverished third world nation. African Americans live under apartheid. America created it and exported it to this world. That includes food apartheid. We have a mass grave in the city of Chicago due to inequities of climate change. And read the Climate Gap Report by USC. And there's a book called Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power. Regentrification is ethnic cleansing, one of the many forms of genocide. The Black Youth Project did a study that said eviction rates for African American women are comparable to Black male incarceration, and then there's spatial deconcentration, and also there is the slaughter of the cities. It's a book by Michael Jones. By Michael Jones, and also the book is about urban renewal as ethnic cleansing, and also there's a movie called Gentrified.
That's
So
a lot.
I think you can have a whole rest of the
Yeah.
evening. I think we should switch seats. So I think I didn't hear a question, but I think what you're raising is that we are not in an absence of information. We're not in an absence of scholarships and thinkers and research that's helping us process it. We have access to this information in multitudes of formats. So while there's an attack on our library databases, there's an attack on our ability to have, there are ways in which people can have access just from their phones. How do we use our ordinary everyday tools as a way to gathering ideas to make sense of information? I think we need to remember that as we try to navigate the ways in which forms of censorship is showing up. Right, there's a value for the neighborhood bookstore. So
the movie Gentrified is ethnic cleansing American style.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, thank you. Any other comments, thoughts? And I would say to all the points you were making, if we do have some thoughts, perhaps right after we wrap up, we can connect because that
I'm
was
looking
a
forward
lot.
to it. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you. All right, let me get to a couple of what I think might be quick responses, perhaps, but I think excellent questions. What does your panel feel is the best way in this year, 2025, for students and families to feel heard, respected, and recognized as citizens of the United States?
So one of the activities or projects, of the many things I do, I volunteer in a school working with middle schoolers every week, every Wednesday. And it's hard to block that time out, but first I have to remember that teachers need help. They're in the middle of this too. And sometimes it's another person, it's lunchtime. So there's a group of students that I gather with at lunchtime and I provide the lunch. They don't have time to go to the cafeteria and then we participate in the programming. So myself and another volunteer, we get together and we talk about goals. We talk about goal setting. That's not offensive. We talk about, processes to which you want to accomplish your goals. What do you think you need? And sometimes it's another way for these students to not feel as if no one's paying attention to them. And then they leave. They haven't missed lunch. They've been able to build community. They talk about things that doesn't have sort of a teacher-centered agenda where they don't get to talk and they have to sit still. And so that volunteerism sort of reminds me of my why. It connects me back to all the other work that I do. And it's a simple hour and it's a commitment, but at the same time, young people don't need a parental voice all the time. They know what you're gonna say already. Okay, you ask the same question every day at 3:30. How was school? It was fine. What did you do? Nothing. I mean, it's dialogue. They need other types of questions, and they also need a space where they can raise the questions for one another. So I would say, what do we do? Like provide spaces and opportunities for young people to get together where you're not controlling the agenda, but you're providing the safe space, you're providing the resources, and you're letting them be so that they can sort of generate, and they can be generative of a healthy process in some particular way.
I think of the importance of mentorship and sponsorship. So as you continue along your academic career in college, getting ready to graduate, having access to those social networks. And when we come from communities where we don't necessarily, have a doctor in the family or an architect or an attorney, those who have already achieved, how do you reach back in to those communities and share that power? Mentorship is one thing, but sponsorship takes it to the next level where you're actually opening those doors and exposing those individuals to your social network, lending your social capital so that they too can achieve.
Thank you. And so this next question, someone noticed that what Venoncia mentioned in terms of community care, the importance of speaking and getting to know your neighbors, intersected with what Connie was saying in terms of zoning and exclusionary practices and how that can get in the way. And it keeps multifamily units and it keeps otherizing folks and so forth. Evanston has attempted to change its zoning from, with multifamily and so forth. And it seems really important that we talk about this and the fear of change and so forth. So when race is not being named, how do you suggest, for any of you, and I would start with Connie and Venoncia, how do you suggest we raise race in part of the narrative when this is being discussed in what's considered a progressive town.
Yeah, I mean, Evanston's been at the forefront. You all have had, Evanston's had reparations. Oak Park has been at the forefront too, in terms of, trying to be exclusionary, trying to look at some of the challenges of exclusionary zoning. How do you talk about race? I think you have to understand the structural, historic, systemic basis of it, and not everybody's going to. But it has ramifications that last generations. So even maybe it's small steps at a time, bringing somebody to a community forum like this, providing articles. Is that getting at the question that you're asking? I'm not sure if I'm answering it correctly, but yeah. I think, it can be challenging sometimes, right? For people that just want to say, well, why is everything about race, or does race have to be about everything? Try looking at it maybe through a socioeconomic lens, whatever it takes to get them there.
Yeah.
Right, and I can't speak directly to the Evanston context because I'm not from Evanston and not familiar enough with the way that you do things to speak to that. But nationally, some of the proxies for race that I've learned about include socioeconomic status, which is not an exact proxy, but moreover, zip code, really looking at being able to achieve the same types of goals by looking at zip codes, because we do live in a highly segregated society, particularly areas like Milwaukee and Chicago. So you certainly can use zip code as a proxy for race, at least in those contexts.
And I regret to inform you, but that's the fundamental basis of my research and has been for the last 25 years, is discussions of race, right? And sometimes you do have to use a Socratic method that can sort of invite people to recognize what they're avoiding. And sometimes in those moments, you can talk about all the things that are substantive and relevant and that are going to help people feel comfortable in dialogue. And then you can ask, is there any particular reason why we're not talking about the race factor and how it relates to this moment? You kind of have to stop, and because it's exhausting running around in circles when you can just go in a straight line. And it's okay, right? But there's the diplomacy of what that means. And so being clear and direct doesn't mean without diplomacy. And so the question is, can we have this conversation being very attentive to what this means in terms of race? And you might be surprised when people may go, I was waiting for somebody else to say, I didn't want to be the one, because no one likes it. But it may be the moment where people go, you know what, that would be really great if we could. And you may learn someone when someone goes, do we have to? And that tells you what work you have. You've got to have a yes or a no. And one of the things we do learn about resiliency is that people have to be confronted with a moment of challenge, right? And so you don't get to great work. You don't build muscle lifting a feather. You got to pick up heavy weight. You don't build muscle without picking up heavy weight. So at some point, you have to ask, can we talk about this in the context of race? And when you learn that people don't want to, now you know that it is about race.
And it's also important to confront NIMBYism when we think about what are the repercussions of not having these conversations? It's just, oh, well, I don't want that. That's not in my area. And what does that do to a community? What does that do to the diversity, the equity and inclusion within a community if you're not willing to have those really difficult conversations? And then instead of saying not in my backyard or not in my neighborhood, why not in my backyard or my neighborhood, right? Look at the positives. What can that actually contribute to my environment?
Well, I know in my career, the DEI training I've been involved in has always insisted upon any kind of training starting with the concept of identity and why identity has to matter. And so we spent a lot of time really talking about identity being the essence of our lived experiences, right? And the starting point of recognizing that each human being has dignity and worth. And if that is your starting point, then the fullness of that human being and the things that they've experienced and how they've walked through the world and the lenses through which they see the world have the utmost value, as much value as your lived experiences. And so if that's true, and their identities and the way that they've walked through the world is true, then race has to be talked about and matter, because the way we walk through the world racially is different for each of us. And if you're going to dismiss or disregard or make invisible the lived experiences of people because of their race and their ethnicity and what have you, then you are dismissing or completely making invisible an aspect of their humanity. And so when folks understand it that way, then you have to understand that race has to be talked about and it has to matter because it's part of what we experience through the lives that we live. And so I think, and 100% to all of this as well, right? So great question, and thank you for asking that. So bring it up, talk about it, right? I have to do a shout out here. I mean, I got two of my colleagues up here are Elmhurst folks. Like I used to work at Elmhurst also. So we got an Elmhurst alum here, class of 2006. I don't know if they want to make themselves known or visible, but they ask, do you want to make yourself visible? No. Okay, that's okay. You don't have to. Do you know of anyone doing this work advocating for history or civics education? And how can we go about advocating for it more forcefully?
Yeah, I mean, Illinois has been better than some states. The McCormick Foundation in Illinois was really instrumental in the big push, along with educators and organizations throughout Illinois. Citizen Advocacy Center in Elmhurst played a big role. Many of us testified in Springfield for bringing back civics. So, I mean, how do we get it back? I mean, I think that's attending your school board meeting, right? Attending local meetings. Just as I said, you have to attend a zoning board meeting. You have to attend your school board meeting and ask the question, are we teaching civics? Is it more than just 1 week of civics? Is it being taught by somebody who's not the football coach? Is it being taught by somebody who's in background in civics? And I think to be aware of the fact that we have lost civics and to know to ask the question is the first step. And then to have the perseverance to be able to actually show up. I mean, that's part of what activism is showing up, right? Like we can have this discussion all day, but unless you're going to go to that zoning committee meeting and unless you're going to go to that school board meeting, it's all for naught. So I would say that would be a good first step.
I call this a speed round, but I am going to speed it up here because we've down to the last 10 minutes. For every question from Aaron out, I'm going to ask one of you to answer, and whoever feels comfortable. So thank you for that. There's a question here that I really wanted to get to before we wrapped up, and it says the title of this event is Cultivating Hope and Inspiring Action. I want to hear about hope and inspiration toward action and real opportunities to build community. So what would you recommend to inspire hope and action? I'll let all three of you answer this one. It's a good question.
That question is really speaking to the pastoral counselor and me, I have to confess. From a spiritual or faith perspective, I have to believe that we can and we will do better. I can't afford to have my own personal pity party. I'm there for a moment. I may wallow because of something I hear on the news or what have you, but I really have to, for myself, for my children, for my community, I have to remain hopeful. There is no other choice but to remain hopeful. Again, as the descendants of enslaved people, to look at where I am today and where we continue to strive towards, there's nothing but hope that made that journey possible. So I have to continue to be a hopeful individual.
Sure, I think that's a great 4x4 relay handoff there that I would accept. Every time I'm with the elders in the South, I feel like I don't even have the right to be frustrated. I had to be sitting here because I had to, write this research article that didn't get published, or my grant got canceled, and I'm literally sitting here looking at someone who survived what they survived, and they're still here to spend the time to teach me and to talk to me. So that sort of hope to action is sort of thinking about what is happening to us, and then what are we trying to do so that our children are not experiencing this again. And so that says to me, what is it that they need? Not because I'm saying this is what they need, but I'm willing to be in conversation with multi-generations. I'm with these elders to help me process and think, but I'm with young people every Wednesday. And I'm talking with them about their goals and what they want to try to do. What kind of activities do they want to have in the summer? What kind of careers are they interested in? And then I have to think, well, what is my leverage? What is my power? Where do I sit in the world so I can actually collaborate and build agency and relationship with other people to build out the very thing? So for me, it's a very much so a multi-generational sense of accountability that I'm just not running around in circles in this world, that I'm sitting in a position where I should be trying to build out structures that put into action what these young people need, which means I can't decide that it's my agenda. I have to yield and not make this about me. I have to listen to the needs of other people and then build out those relationships and those partnerships so that we can actually materialize these things, which means, resources are different, but we have to galvanize resources and plan for those relationships so people can actually experience the things that we're thinking about. And it does mean sacrifice. There is a sacrificial aspect to that in terms of time and building out resources and connecting with that. Okay. There's lots of organizations that are excited to fund projects that are not connected to the federal government, right? They believe in these things, but they're also looking at how to get information out. So you have to be in conversation and in community with people in order to build out actionable plans in order to support communities.
So as I was thinking about the title, I had to be honest. I'm a political scientist who spent my life studying democracy, and I'm really, really worried. And, how am I going to find hope? But I look here tonight and you all are hope. The fact that you took time out of your evening to be here tonight is hopeful. The fact that I have students who care about politics and other people and equality, that gives me hope that this is something that will be carried on long after I leave, that maybe I'm touching a handful of students that will care. Maybe something that we said here tonight matters to some of you and it will make a difference.
And there are organizations that have firepower, for lack of a better phrase, so you need to look for those organizations that are already in the building, the activism space, and they need another person to be on the phone. They need another person to be about letter writing campaigns. So sometimes we feel like, do I have to start something? I don't know where to begin. No, but you do have to look to who are the organizations that are actually building out these efforts, but they need you. And so you then bring another willful approach to supporting things that are already in motion, which means we also have to be in relationship again to learn about what's going on and who's actually engaged in doing work. And there's lots of exciting things that are happening and that start very small and that become very large.
We are down to just a few minutes. I know we have some really great questions here. A couple folks asking about Project 2025 and what's the alternative to that? How do we build that? There were a few questions about that. There were questions about how rural communities respond and what are the consequences to folks understanding how to maintain democracy. One person was asking about how to strike a balance between self-care and doing everything they can to stay politically active while managing very, very challenging employment and raising a child. What do folks in Washington D.C. want? What is it? Is it power? Is it, is it money? Is it just fear feeding off of it? So lots of great questions. Would you all be okay if folks came up afterward and just asked some of those questions first thing? I also want to thank you. And I also wanted to ask if our Zoom audience had any questions that we weren't able to get to as well. And maybe we can ask one of those. Do we have one?
No, we sent it. You already addressed it.
They were here. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Zoom audience, for that. We are down to our last couple of minutes. Can we offer our panelists a round of applause for their... them, and I want them to sign what I'm giving them because these are rock stars here. So we're going to get to those in just a moment. I also would like to ask if we can give a round of applause to our YWCA staff, including Sharice and Ted. Folks that are here today, my colleagues who are here, including Gabrielle and Aaron, who were running the show in terms of the Zoom presentation and really making sure that that went smoothly. So a round of applause to them. Shout out to our front desk staff for welcoming in everybody that came in today, and a gentleman named Peter who works really hard every day and got this room really set up and looking beautiful today. So he went home, as he should have after a long day, but give Peter a round of applause.
Please give yourself a round of applause.
Yes. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, it's, one of the things we try to do really earnestly here at the YWCA is to listen to our community and listen to your feedback. So when we put together programs like this, we are able to do these programs and do them better each time based on your feedback. So if you could take a few moments before you leave tonight, I know our Zoom audience will have a Zoom link sent to you all in terms of how you can fill out our survey. For the folks that are here tonight, we do have, you can see around the room, these little sheets that are kind of around the room that look like this, that have a QR code. There's one there, and then one behind me and one over here. If you could use your cell phone to access a QR code, it'll take you directly to the survey. If you prefer not to do that, we can get you the link before you leave, but we would love your feedback on how you thought tonight went, what you learned, and what you would like to suggest we can do to continue to provide programs like this and how we can improve and grow as we strive to meet the needs of our community. I will say, and I'm probably on firm ground to announce this now, probably. I'm looking at Charisse. So we really value the work of folks who started the Unite Against Racism work and the work that's been done here. Last year was the first year we did a panel. Shout out to Heather Sweeney, one of my former colleagues who has left and put together last year's Unite Against Racism. We've started a kind of a tradition here, and we want to build on these conversations. And one of the things we're going to launch in the fall is a podcast. For those of you who enjoy podcasts, it'll be available via YouTube and other podcast outlets. And so we are going to host a podcast that's going to engage in these types of dialogues more frequently to have you have more access to this kind of stuff and a really increasing frequency. So we want to do that. And in the meantime, we are down to our last minute or so. We are grateful for your presence here tonight. Again, thank you for coming out. One more round of applause for our panelists. Our panelists will receive a book. This is a photography book on the history of immigrants coming to the United States. And
Oh my gosh, there's an ant.
I know one of the ways I engage in self-care is through lighting candles. So we have a candle for each of our panelists. There you are.
I like candles too.
Yes, candles are awesome.
Thank
So there you are. Nice. There you are. All right. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it. Please fill out our survey. I do. It's my go around. Yeah. I'll be right on.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I remember.
And it's been in place since 1994. Now that's just, that would probably have questions that would have been that. Also, I wanted to say so hard as well too. Also,